Howdy, folks, and welcome to the first Sierra Forum of 2018. In fact, this is the first Sierra Forum ever. Sierra Forums are a chance for the Sierra Club's members, our volunteer leaders, our supporters, and our champions to hear from the leadership of the organization, to hear sometimes over the course of the year from our partners and allies, to get up to date on what's happening with the environmental movement and assaults against the environment, and then to learn what you can do to get involved with the effort to defend our public lands, our public waters, and our public health. I'm your host for these conversations throughout most of 2018. I'm Jason Mark, the editor-in-chief of Sierra Magazine, which is the national magazine of the Sierra Club. And I'm really psyched that for today's Sierra Forum, the first of 2018, we've got some of the best and brightest from the organization. You'll see there Michael Brune. He's the executive director of the Sierra Club and our fearless leader. Also here with us today is Melinda Pierce. She's the senior director of the Sierra Club's federal lobbying team on Capitol Hill. And then Pat Gallagher there, he's the director of our environmental law program, fielding a cadre of attorneys across the country who are defending our bedrock environmental laws. Before we hop into today's program, I know that Michael wants to share some words about the really awful tragedy that happened yesterday in Florida.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. And good morning, everyone, or good morning if you're on the West Coast, and good afternoon everywhere else. Thanks for joining us. And of course, thanks for being a part of the Sierra Club. I'm looking forward to this conversation, and in particular, looking forward to hearing from Melinda and Pat, and then also the questions from everybody in the second half of the program. But as Jason said, before we get started, I just wanted to, on behalf of the Sierra Club, to extend our sympathies and prayers to the victims yesterday and their families and friends from the shooting in Florida. This is no way to live, really. There have been 18 shootings so far in 2018, more than one deadly shooting every week this year. It was President Obama who said during his campaign, then again when he was elected for the first term, that those who love our country can and should work to change it. Getting violence out of our culture, out of our schools, out of our society is a problem for all of us. It's a complex problem with no single solution, but it takes all of our engagement. Our engagement as parents, our engagement as neighbors and friends and community members, our engagement as voters, and probably our engagement as consumers as well. So again, I really want to extend our sympathies and our prayers to the victims and their families. And also I hope that this is a moment of resolve for our country where we can move forward towards solutions. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Mike. I know it's a really, really hard day for a lot of folks. As we jump into it, I guess we're going to first talk about what we can expect to see in 2018 in terms of other attempts from the Trump administration, as well as other attempts from Congress to roll back 40 years, in fact, more of environmental protections. We're going to have a conversation among Mike and Pat and Melinda, and then we'll go to audience questions. So if you have a question and you're on Facebook Live, just post that in the comments field and we'll get to those questions in about 25 minutes. So let's start with the Trump administration's 2019 budget that was just released this week. So folks say that, you know, a federal budget is a statement of priorities and a statement of principles. So Mike, what do we see in terms of priorities and principles from this proposed 2019 budget?
Not much that surprises us, frankly. The president's been in office for more than a year now. And if you take the tax bill that was passed at the end of last year and the budget in tandem with each other, what you see is a significant giveaway in the form of the tax bill that was passed mostly to the wealthy, and then a significant package of cuts to EPA, Department of Interior, the clean energy programs within the Department of Energy, the National Science Foundation, and a gutting of enforcement efforts, particularly that would hold polluters accountable. At the same time, we see an increase in funding for fossil fuel research, nuclear power research, and the types of activities that would generate more pollution. This is coming, of course, from an administration that has had a series of travel scandals where you have Scott Pruitt flying all around the world, selling fossil fuels, and traveling in first-class cabins paid for by you and me. And it's also coming at a time where we're seeing an aggressive undermining of air and water and climate regulations that put all of our health at risk.
Sorry about that. I was muted for a second. Melinda, I'd love to send it over to you for a second. You're a long-time hand there on Capitol Hill working to defend our public lands and waters. So this is a draft proposal from the White House. These are aspirations that might not necessarily come to pass. I'd love to hear from you. I mean, the administration has certainly had, unfortunately, more successes than we would like in rolling back some of our long-standing environmental protections, but also in some ways they haven't been able to fulfill their goals. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the administration misses along with its hits and what the Sierra Club and our allies have been doing there on Capitol Hill, again, to protect our lands and waters.
Sure, and you're right. The Trump budget blueprint is not, the law of the land. In fact, Congress has the power of the purse. These programs, these cuts, these, important agencies, the funding decisions rest here, where I am, on Capitol Hill, not with the president. Nevertheless, it's the signal of his priorities, his values, and we hope like heck that the Trump Republican Congress alliance isn't going to rubber stamp what Mike has laid out are some pretty bad priorities, attacks on public health, on the agencies that protect our lands, waters, wildlife. What's interesting is we're still not done with the funding process that started last year. And so the Trump budget that came out this week looks very much like the Trump budget that came out last year. And that, as of yet, still hasn't crossed the finish line. We're in our fifth of a series of continuing resolutions. So far, so good. There haven't been the deep cuts enacted. We're still working on status quo, and the kinds of riders and vision of elimination of programs hasn't come to pass. But that doesn't mean our country is moving forward.
And I think kind of what you're addressing there is that in some ways, this administration is, I think it's fair to say, incompetent sometimes in reaching its own political goals. And I think a year ago, many of us in the environmental movement felt that, at least in the short term, that incompetence kind of works to our advantage. Pat, I'd love you to talk about that a little bit. I mean, we saw a big win for the Sierra Club and the Sierra Club's Beyond Coal campaign with the announcement of the planned closure of a massive coal-fired power plant in Brunner Island, Pennsylvania. And I kind of following it, it seems that this is a good example of how when the administration ignores or otherwise kind of fumbles an issue, that can come back to bite them. I wonder if you could talk about how the administration's, I guess it's fair to say, fecklessness sometimes is been an advantage to the Sierra Club and others in defending the climate and our lands and waters.
Sure. So I'll start with the adage that haste makes waste, and that's what they're doing. They're trying to get rid of stuff really hastily, and so on multiple occasions we've been able to slap them back in court. In one instance, they tried to say that they were going to suspend smog controls, just sort of willy-nilly for a year, to just sort of push them out, with no justification whatsoever. All we had to do was write them a letter and basically say, we're going to sue you. You can't do that. And they backed down. So there's a lot of that going on. The Brunner Island story is a super interesting story because I think it brings together some threads from various parts of the story. So it's a giant coal plant. It's a really dirty coal plant. It's in Pennsylvania, and it's polluting the heck out of Connecticut because all the smoke's going downwind. So we worked with the state of Connecticut. We actually did the atmospheric modeling. We got these scientists to show how the smoke was drifting. We got Connecticut to petition EPA to say, hey, you got to do something about this plant. So EPA, like what they're doing a lot is they're just ignoring people. They're just blowing them off. So that's what they did to Connecticut. So they went to court, we intervened in the case, we got a court order saying they got to respond, and then we got into settlement negotiations, and they said, hey, we're just going to shut down the plant. This is just not worth it. So it's kind of this multi-pronged pressure that works, that I think the Sierra Club's really good at, and I think that will continue to be effective because these guys, they just don't know what they're doing, basically.
And Jason, I wonder if I can jump in. It's a combination of incompetence. They have folks that are coming straight from the fossil fuel industry and trying to run governments, but it's also that Trump has failed to get a sufficient number of people in to populate the government. So EPA has 2 people who have been confirmed running that agency. And so it's incompetence, it's that the personnel aren't there, and then one of the really scary things, Jason, is the sort of purging of the talent and expertise of the career staff who can't serve under people like Scott Pruitt and are being forced out.
And also, I mean, you see more than a year into the Trump administration, and still nobody is heading the White House Council on Environmental Quality. So there's incompetence, but also, Mike, I'd love you to talk about also sometimes overreach, Trump administration overreach. I think a good example of that would be this proposal that was announced at the beginning of this year to open up virtually all U.S. waters on the Atlantic, on the Pacific, in the Gulf of Mexico, and good chunks of also the Arctic Ocean, to offshore oil and gas drilling. And we've seen a really strong pushback, not only from Democrats in coastal states, but also from Republicans in coastal states. And so how does also sometimes this overreach play into the Sierra Club's efforts, again, to push back against this retrograde agenda?
Yeah, I want to say a couple things about that. First, about incompetence in general. I think it's important to have a narrow definition about this administration's incompetence because in some senses, as you heard from Pat and Melinda, the way in which they are trying to undermine the safeguards for air and water and wildlife and climate have been not in accord with the law and laws that have been established and on the books for many decades. However, this is an administration that is sadly brutally competent in its attempts to attack almost every kind of safeguard that's out there. And as Melinda was pointing out, is doing a very aggressive job, and in some cases an effective job at dissolving the scientific advisory agencies, pushing scientists out of office, depowering the ability for career employees to do their job to protect the public across all agencies. And so when we talk about incompetence, we shouldn't get complacent about the damage that this administration is doing to families and communities across the country. But having said that, about overreach, I think that, talk about offshore oil drilling. Some of our members who have some experience will remember James Watt and the impact that he had during the Reagan administration, a previous Secretary of the Interior. Well, it's fair to say, I think, that Ryan Zinke, who's the current Secretary of the Interior, is making James Watt look like Al Gore. I mean, let's think about what has happened and what's been coming out of the Interior Department over the last 13 months or so. We've seen an increase in proposed fees for national parks, so that if you're one of the millions of Americans who like to go to Yosemite or Joshua Tree National Park, or well more than a dozen other parks, you'll now be paying $70 every time that you go. And it's believed that that's going to drive out lower income Americans who share in these national parks just like wealthy Americans do. We have seen, of course, an historic and unprecedented level of undermining protections for places like Bears Ears National Monument, or Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. More than 2 million acres is proposed to be unprotected, which of course we're challenging in court. And then among a long list, we have, of course, this overreach in the proposal to expand offshore oil drilling on our coast, basically anywhere we have coasts, except for the state of Florida, because there's a Republican, there's a desire to have a Republican take over the Senate seat there. So at the Sierra Club, I think that we are comforted by the fact that we have a highly talented law program that is going to fight this proposal, and we're confident we'll be successful. We're also comforted by the fact that governors of both parties on both coasts and across the country are opposed to an expansion of offshore oil drilling. And I would say most of all, we're comforted by the fact that there are millions of people, tens of millions of people, who don't want to see an expansion of offshore oil drilling. They know that clean energy is a driving part of the US economy, and it is almost inevitable that our economy will be powered by clean energy, not by fuels that are drilled and exploited off our coasts.
I think the old saying in Texas is all hat and no cattle, which is a pretty good description of Secretary Zinke. And Pat, I'd love you to talk about, Mike was mentioning the attempted, and it's important to underscore attempted rollbacks and basically, reversals of these national monuments. Pat, can you just really quick give the viewers a quick primer on, can the president even do this? I mean, can the president, under the Antiquities Act, or attempt to roll back protections established by predecessors? Is that even lawful?
No. How's that?
Good answer.
So, yeah, no president has ever revoked a monument after it's been established. That just hasn't happened. And that's why I think Trump and Zinke have been trying to sort of cut the monuments rather than just sort of abandon them altogether. But they don't have the authority to modify them either, because back in the 70s, Congress passed something called the Federal Land Policy Management Act, and that's got a bunch of provisions in it, and I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but it's pretty clear that at that point, they took away all authority to be tinkering with monuments that had been designated previously. So that's the crux of our argument, and we are in court, and we'll fight it to the end. I want to mention something just in response to what Mike mentioned. I don't feel complacent. I'm very troubled by the exodus of scientists and career staff at EPA and Department of Interior, et cetera. The one glimmer of hope, or the one bright light, is that we are in constant communication now with groups that have been set up among sort of ex-EPA employees, and they're actually networking with people inside the agency that are still working there but feel frustrated. So we're hopeful that we can sort of continue this community of people, so that 3 years from now, when we get power back, we can repopulate the agency to some extent and get the intelligence back in government.
Thanks, Pat, for that. I just want to remind folks again, if you've got a question for Mike or Pat or Melinda, just put it there in the Facebook chat. We've already got one question from Dave. We've got a question from Sherry, and we'll get to those in just a minute. But I do want to ask you, Melinda, I mean, how does some of these, again, these attempted rollbacks of public lands, how's it playing out there on Capitol Hill? I mean, you certainly still have an opposition that's doing its best to defend these bedrock laws. Well,
that's right. I think there are two things here. One are the people, and one are the folks, the people who are populating Capitol Hill. The scope and the sort of brazen attacks by Trump on our public lands and on our agencies, et cetera, it's inspired, an outpouring of resistance. The Sierra Club is getting more and more folks coming to us, wanting to join, trying to figure out how they can get involved. And then they're turning around and going to public hearings to oppose rollbacks of the Clean Power Plan, public hearings all around the country right now that are going on, opposing the OCS, the drilling off our coasts policies. And that resistance and that sort of resurgence of grassroots activism has been really powerful. And now what we need to do is translate, the boots on the ground, the pressure people feel from the districts into that resistance on Capitol Hill. So the one thing that we have seen from the Republican-led Congress, of course, is attacks on every clean air, clean water, et cetera. They can get bad ideas through the House, but the Senate has been a place where these bad ideas have gone to die. There is a strong Senate firewall of opposition that has been able to fight back standalone legislation to undo public health and environmental standards. Where we are most vulnerable and where the fight is now is when the party in power is trying to use these funding bills to pass riders or to cut agency budgets, and that's the fight we're having right now. So standalone legislation to undermine public lands, public health hasn't passed, and that's again in great because of the Senate firewall and the kind of public outcry that's boosting that.
I want to go to, thanks so much for that, Melinda. I think a great example, right, would be the way that Republicans snuck in this provision to open up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil drilling, sort of snuck into that giant quote unquote tax reform bill at the end of last year. We've already got a number of questions piling up both on Facebook and here in the Zoom Q&A. And I just want to go to a couple of those. We do have a question here from, excuse me real quick, a question here from Liz. I think this is for you, Pat. What legal action is the Sierra Club taking or planning to take with respect to offshore drilling?
Okay, there's a lot going on, so let me try to summarize it as quickly as I can. So the Tax Act removed the protection for the Arctic coastal plain, but all that does is that it starts a process where the Department of Interior has to promulgate regulations to govern how they might explore for oil in the area, et cetera, et cetera. Similarly, off the coasts of California, the Atlantic, et cetera, Gulf of Mexico, they're now in what's called a leasing program phase, where they're taking comments on the scope of the leasing program they may pursue. So we're submitting comments on that. We'll end up litigating that in the end. We're already in court challenging Trump's rescission of protection for the Arctic and the Atlantic canyons. Those are two areas of our oceans that President Obama had withdrawn from oil and gas drilling. So this is kind of like the monuments thing. Trump basically put them back on the table for oil and gas drilling. That's already in litigation in federal court in Alaska. Then they're also trying to permit what they call seismic exploration, where they send these huge bursts of air down into the ocean floor to sort of detect oil and gas, and it's very, very destructive. So we're waiting for a shoe to drop on that front, and then we'll go into court to challenge those plans as well. So there's a ton of activity out there happening. The good news is that this stuff takes time. It's not like Trump can just wave his hand and the next day there's a bunch of oil rigs out drilling. You know, they have to go through all these regulatory processes, permitting processes. Lots of times oil companies won't even drill until they do all this sort of exploration, sort of pre-exploration work. So there's some hope that we can slow these guys down until we get power back. And so I think that's a little bit of solace for us. And then the last thing I'm going to say is not getting enough attention. We're paying attention, but we're trying to get more people to pay attention. And I think it's a great lever for us. Trump is actually proposing to weaken the blowout preventer rule. Now, if you guys remember the BP disaster, that was a blowout preventer that failed, right? I think that we just run a 24/7 video of the Macondo blowout just spewing oil, and then we just sort of paste Trump's proposed rule on top of that. It's just outrageous that he's doing that, and some other safety regs that he's trying to roll back as well. So there's lots going on, but the good news is it's going to take him a long time, and I think we can slow him down and minimize the damage pretty much.
Mike, I got a couple questions that I'd love for you to tackle here. One's from Linda, and then I think also echoed here by a question from Scott. And I think we'll come back to this throughout the course of the conversation on different fronts. But Scott asks, what are some of the best actions that can have the biggest impact on preserving, restoring, and regenerating our environment? And Linda asks simply, for marching orders, what can folks do? So people who are Sierra Club members, supporters, champions, what can they do? And what are there, as Linda asked, what are their marching orders?
All right. Well, first, Linda and Scott, thanks for the question. I guess the shortest answer is whatever it is that makes your heart sing. There's not any one specific thing that is the most important. We have a lot of our members who take action as voters. They vote in every election, but not only that, they knock on doors, they make phone calls, they help others put up yard signs. We have members who take action as activists. They go and they testify when there are public hearings, they march, they put pressure on elected officials to do the right thing, or corporations. We have members who donate and who make monthly gifts to the Sierra Club to support some of the experts that you see on this call and other volunteers and staff across the Sierra Club. We have people who take action as investors and make sure that their company or their institution, wherever they work, doesn't invest in fossil fuels and redirects their financial assets towards clean energy and other solutions. What we have found at the Sierra Club, what makes us unique, is that we have more than 3 million members and supporters across the organization. We have a chapter in every state, local groups in almost every major city, in every congressional district. We are powered by literally tens of thousands of volunteers who are putting in, some of them 20, 30, 50, 60 hours a week, some of them just a couple hours a week. And that is what makes the Sierra Club strong. So what I would say to Linda, to Scott, first is thank you for engaging. Thanks for being a part of the Sierra Club and the work that we do. Thanks for your support. And look to find a way to stay engaged over the long term. Look to do something that you really love. It might be taking middle school kids out into the forests or a park nearby every other Saturday. It might be organizing to make sure we elect true environmental champions. It might be working for clean energy and getting your city to be powered by 100% renewable energy, or stopping a coal or gas plant. But whatever it is, find something that you really like to do, and then bring all of your friends and family and neighbors to help you along with that. So find what it is that inspires you that you can do over the long term.
We've got a couple of questions here, and I think all three of you have sort of touched on this briefly. Pat's actually phrase was "until we get power back." So I'd love to hear, I guess, maybe a little bit from Melinda and then from Mike as well, to address, I think, what is kind of like the 800-pound gorilla, which is the midterm elections this fall. We do have a specific question here from Peter, who wants to know, what is the political priority for the Sierra Club in these midterm elections? And I'm wondering if you guys could sketch that out. What is the Sierra Club going to be doing to ensure that we have a Congress that's committed to defending our public lands, our public waters, our public health, and the climate that we all share?
Mike, you want to start out?
Sure, happy to. I would say, first of all, that what we're going to do is we're going to leverage the strengths of the Sierra Club, which again are the millions of people who are part of the Sierra Club. We are in the process of doing a thorough analysis of all of the ways, all of the seats that are up at the state legislative level, the mayoral level, and in different local races across the country, to see how that would impact cities going to 100% clean energy, or the opposition to pipelines and other fossil fuel infrastructure, power plants at the same time. And then we're looking at how those are spread across the country and how they coincide with national goals, such as having a pro-environment majority in the House and in the Senate, and in winning governor's races. I would say that our goal is to marry an ability to advance local races that would accelerate our progress on clean energy in a way that is in accord with having a pro-environment majority take over the House. We're certainly going to be focused on some Senate races as well. We'll most definitely be focused on governor's races. But if I were to answer Peter's question really specifically, it is most likely that we see the House as probably the biggest opportunity at this point, but in conjunction with local races, because increasingly it's those local races where we're making big progress on climate change, and we're developing a farm system of environmental legislators who will do the right thing, hopefully within both parties. Thanks for the question, Peter.
Yeah, and Jason, I'll just pile on by saying what's really great to be a lobbyist and advocate at the Sierra Club is when I go to Capitol Hill, these members of Congress know that Sierra Club has the boots on the ground in their districts. We're not just experts or great communicators or what have you. We really do represent their constituents. And again, what I'm seeing is such a level of engagement, unprecedented level of engagement at the local level, where people want to go to the town halls, people want to show up and have district meetings, people want to be trained to come to DC and lobby in DC. So, you know, the level of activism at the grassroots is so critical, and that's what's going to keep the pressure on members of Congress to urge them to do the right thing in terms of voting against, you know, attacks on the environment and supporting proactive legislation to tackle climate and protect species and protect water and air once again.
I think we'll come back in a minute to this question about, you know, what folks can do outside of the kind of federal arena, the state and local politics. But before we do that, a couple questions for you here, Pat. Dawn wants to know, what are the laws, or what's the kind of legal ability of the administration, and her word is to infiltrate Bears Ears. But I think perhaps what she's addressing here is these reports we've seen that you know, the way that Bears Ears was redrawn seems to be very carefully redrawn to perhaps increase uranium, or to have new uranium mining there in southern Utah. And then I've got another question for you, Pat, but maybe first you could talk about what the administration's abilities are under current law to, I think, bring new extractive and damaging activities, development activities, extractive industries into southern Utah and those lands that were formerly protected.
Well, I mean, the simple answer is that if we win our case, then they can't go in there because it goes back to monument status, and everything will be protected again. So that's the grand prize that we're seeking. Worst case scenario, that somehow, I mean, what Trump did is he issued an executive order purporting to use the Antiquities Act as the basis for, you know, redrawing the boundaries of Bears Ears. So again, if we win that case, you know, it's fine. They don't go in there, they don't get the uranium. We're actually monitoring right now people who may go in there to start to stake uranium claims. And if they start to do that, we will engage at every step of the way, because they'd have to go through a whole sort of leasing permitting process to try to start mining uranium. Again, that would take a long, you know, many years or several years to accomplish, and we will engage early and often.
Hey, Jake, so I'd like to add on to that just a bit, which is to say we're also taking a long game approach on this. You know, clearly everything that Pat said obviously is true, and it's arguably one of the main priorities of the Sierra Club, certainly for our work on lands. But also we know that as long as we are dependent on dirty fuels, whether it's the fuel that comes from uranium or the coal mining that is being proposed in southern Utah, or the oil and gas development that's happening across the West, until we have states, companies, cities, and our economy that's powered by 100% clean energy, we're going to continue to see these threats to our coastlines, to our parks, even to our wilderness areas, and certainly to our climate. So from a big picture, what the Sierra Club always works to do is to make sure that any government's actions, Democrat or Republican, are in accord with the law, with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, National Environmental Policy Act, that we're working to protect the most special places in this country and keep those places protected, as Pat was talking about. But we've got to get beyond dirty fuels in all facets of our economy. And so to the question from people earlier who were asking how they could get involved, we need you to get involved in both aspects of this, fighting the worst proposals that are coming from state and local and federal governments, but also to advocate with as much creativity and tenacity for the solutions that we need. We have to make sure that we hasten the transition to clean energy, and that transition to a clean energy economy is one that generates in wider prosperity for our country, that the workers who are in the coal and oil and gas industries find a home in the clean energy industries and are able to sustain their families in the same way. So the solutions part of our work is as important as the defense work that Pat and Melinda and many others are engaged in.
And Mike, and on that question of solutions, this kind of gets to the topic I was sort of alluding to a second ago, which is that not all the actions happening in DC, and there's a lot of some of the most encouraging glimmers of progress are coming from cities, from municipalities, from states who are spearheading this movement towards a 100% clean energy economy. So I'd like you to talk a little bit. Let's kind of step back from DC for a minute and step back from the course a second. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the Sierra Club's Ready for 100 campaign and how that's trying to, again, foster this outside of DC and just in local decision-making bodies.
Sure. So the Ready for 100 campaign is a campaign at the Sierra Club, but there are dozens of organizations now who are working in coalition, advocating for our institutions, our universities and other schools, our churches, our federal or state buildings, but also cities and companies to go all the way to 100% clean, renewable energy as quickly as possible. Before Trump was elected president, we had about 15 or so cities that had made this commitment to go to 100% clean energy. Now we have well more than 50. Big cities as well, Atlanta, Georgia, San Diego, California, small cities like Georgetown, Texas, run by a Republican mayor, and many other cities run by Republican mayors or Republican city councils. What we're seeing is because of the desire to make sure that we're sticking to our commitments as part of the Paris Climate Accord, and because of the desire for local citizens to control their own energy destiny and be able to produce and consume power from renewables, and because of the affordability of solar and wind and energy storage and the affordability of energy efficiency programs, we're seeing that clean energy can beat coal and beat natural gas and beat certainly nuclear power almost everywhere across the country and in most countries around the world. So what we expect is that over the next few years, we will see literally hundreds of communities, small towns to big cities, all commit, not just committing to 100% clean energy, but implementing those commitments. For example, the city of Los Angeles late last year made a commitment to have all of their buses, second largest fleet of buses in the country, move to electric over the next 15 years, over the next 13 years. We're also seeing from Los Angeles an attempt to move their buildings off of natural gas to clean, renewable electricity at the same time. Those actions are being replicated in literally dozens of cities across the country, soon to be hundreds of cities and hundreds of companies across the country and around the world. It's one of the things that gives me the most hope about our ability to act on climate and to organize effectively, not just here in the United States, but around the world, in spite of the absence of leadership that we're seeing from this current administration.
Thanks so much for that, Mike. And I also just want to thank everybody who's been putting in comments on either the Facebook chat or just directly in the Zoom chat. Thank you so much for your questions. And if you have a question or a comment, please throw it in now. We'll try to get to it. I got a couple questions here. Here's a little bit of a tough one. I don't know who wants to field it. Maybe you, Mike. Both a question from Holly and a question from Sherry, which is that, we've already got all this CO2 and methane in the atmosphere that's trapping in heat and making our oceans more acidic. What are some carbon sequestration technologies that the Sierra Club might support, ways to actually, I think, take some of that atmospheric pollution, that carbon pollution that's already out there, and I guess, suck it up?
So to speak. Well, look, I wasn't aware we were going to be doing tough questions on this forum. I thought they were all kind of softball questions. I'm just kidding. So it is a great question. Clearly we are well above 350 parts per million in the atmosphere, which is the safe level at which our civilization has grown. It's a little bit above the safe level around which civilization and our economies have grown over the last long period of time. My phone's ringing. Sorry about that. So what we clearly need to do is find a way in which we can reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, preserve and restore our forests, and find different ways of producing food that don't emit as much carbon, other greenhouse gases. And I would say that what policymakers, environmental groups, corporate leaders alike need to come around is to figure out ways in which we can begin to absorb carbon from the atmosphere and store it most likely in our soils. What the Sierra Club is exploring this year actually is what are the right set of policies that would guide an organization like the Sierra Club? What are the ways in which we can look at the agriculture, forest industries to promote more sustainable practices, promote local farming, to promote different tools and policies that would enable these solutions to actually take place and make a significant impact. We have a lot of concern about the more technical solutions, so-called solutions that have been proposed, geoengineering type of activities, which we think would bear significant risks and could have some significant side effects. But I think the conversation around how do we capture carbon from the atmosphere, how do we reduce atmospheric levels of carbon, is going to be an increasingly important one. And I would say, to be fair and honest, that we don't have a comprehensive set of solutions at the Sierra Club. That's why we're embarking on this work, nor do we have a sufficient level of analysis and leadership from the domestic and international policy community as well. It's an issue that needs more study.
I would just like to say that I kind of jump on and briefly step out of my role as moderator. I mean, there's a great though Venn diagram between our work to protect public lands and waters and that effort to sequester carbon, right? An intact forest is going to suck up more carbon than a forest that's been logged. A healthy grassland is going to suck up more carbon than a grassland that's being degraded or being used for fracking. So it's wonderful to sort of see that convergence of solutions. I just want to give a shout out here to Norm, who reports that on Tuesday, there was a great event in Columbia, South Carolina, where folks converged to oppose proposals for offshore drilling, as well as to support the Ready for 100 campaign there in Columbia, the state capital, or in South Carolina. So we get another kind of convergence of both resisting and defending our waters and promoting those solutions. Kind of staying on the topic that we were talking about earlier about local action, Pat, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what the environmental law program is doing sort of at the grassroots level to enlist and then make best use of a team of pro bono attorneys or retired attorneys who want to use their specialized skill set to, again, defend our bedrock environmental laws.
Sure. It's been very heartening since the election, the amount of outpouring from the legal community that I've seen. I've never seen anything like this. I've been practicing law for over 30 years. I think people just want to put their talent to use in any way they can. So we've actually formed, in coalition with some other groups, we formed a sort of a network of pro bono attorneys. And a lot of them right now are helping us with our secrecy work because one of the main thrusts of our legal effort right now is to make sure that Trump, Pruitt, Zinke can't hide the ball. Like they can't do backroom deals, be cutting deals with lobbyists, whatever. So we've submitted something like 350 Freedom of Information Act requests covering the whole waterfront in collaboration with probably 24 or 36 other NGOs. And that a lot of that work's being handled by pro bono lawyers. So it's a wonderful effort. It's a really core part of our resistance work. And a lot of those FOIA requests are now in court. I think there's probably somewhere near a dozen lawsuits now in federal court. So I think they're going to start to pop. We're going to start to see some decisions and some accountability for the Trump administration. That's happening mainly with the pro bono group.
And Pat, it was what, just last week that the Sierra Club had to sue the EPA for not responding to former FOIA. I mean, it was almost like a FOIA of a FOIA, right? A Freedom of Information Act request of a Freedom of Information Act request. Yeah,
this was written up in the Washington Post. It's kind of it's a funny story because they've been so obstinate about responding to FOIAs. So we sent them a FOIA saying, can you send us your communications about how you're responding to FOIAs? Like, what are your systems for responding to FOIA? And they refused to answer that one too, so we had to sue them. So it's just, But before I stop, I want to get back to something in terms of the solutions side. I want to emphasize that our legal program, probably more than half of our effort is aimed at solutions, not just fighting off regulatory rollbacks and all that stuff. Because in every state, or most states, there's a public utilities commission that runs the electric grid. So we're able to go into all these states and file legal papers saying, hey, you need to do this much solar, or make it easier for people to connect with their renewable systems, or fighting back against the tariffs that they're trying to put on solar. So there's a huge amount of energy at the state level in front of these PUCs, also including electric vehicles. We're getting utilities to buy into a vision. Hey, well, we're an electric company. Let's just build out a whole boatload of electric vehicle charging stations. Then we'll make money off of that, and we'll jumpstart the electric vehicle industry. So we're doing that at the state level as well. So just to echo what Mike said, there's tremendous progress, tremendous hope happening at the state and local level.
Thanks so much for that, Pat. It's really encouraging to hear the work that Environmental Law Program and your network of pro bono and volunteer attorneys are doing. Mike, I think this is a question probably for you from Kit, and she wants to know what the Sierra Club is doing specifically to engage communities of color, to engage low-income communities, and to engage other communities here in the U.S. that perhaps have not been as deeply engaged in the environmental movement.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Kit. We're doing plenty. Leslie Fields is a woman who has been running our environmental justice and healthy communities program for a number of years right now. She's based out of our DC office. And part of what we're doing is looking for ways in which we can support communities that are fighting toxic pollution and other forms of pollution to air and water within their communities in places like Puerto Rico, which of course has had a significant amount of pollution issues that they've been dealing with for many years, and of course exacerbated by the hurricane last year. Down in Texas is another area where we're doing a large amount of work. What we're trying to do at the Sierra Club is to make sure that across the organization and hopefully across the movement, we are deepening our relationships with communities of color, with the communities that face a disproportionate share of air and water pollution across the country. And the way in which we do that is in part by listening to these communities, understanding better how those communities are impacted, what the sources of pollution are, and how can we work with them to make sure that there's a transition to, in many cases, cleaner energy sources, but also finding ways in which to secure more funding for other groups that aren't the Sierra Club, often underfunded organizations, or even just volunteer-led organizations. How do we increase the access to public policymakers so that it's not simply big groups like the Sierra Club who get a chance to sit with governors or attorneys general or members of Congress, but that we're working with local community groups who often don't have that kind of access? How do we use our stature to help other organizations? And then to think through, how do we marry big international or national goals with solutions that really work for people on the ground? So I guess one final example I'll give is we had a victory last week, or actually on Monday, where a massive coal plant in North Texas, the Big Brown coal plant, was finally retired, and it's being replaced by clean energy. In fact, wind power in the state of Texas now exceeds the amount of coal power that gets fed into the grid, or it did at the end of last year. So we're seeing a massive transition towards clean energy there. But in North Texas, this particular plant, it was the single largest source of sulfur dioxide pollution in the country. Not just the largest coal plant, but the single largest source of a pollutant that is a major irritant to eyes and nose and throat and the lungs of millions of Americans. If you have asthma, you know what I'm talking about. We worked for years on that effort with local communities, many of them communities of color, to find a way in which we could push this plant into retirement, find a way to make sure that that retirement resulted in an increase of clean energy. So I guess the short answer, the short ending to a long answer to a short question is that we try to approach this with a little bit of humility. We look for ways in which we can elevate local communities and their voices, use our stature as an organization to make sure that the voices of local communities, communities of color, low-income communities are being heard, and think about ways in which we can advocate for solutions so that those solutions are being felt at the local level.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that really thoughtful response. I got a question here, and I don't know, maybe this is for you, Melinda, or who wants to grab this one. Sounds like a local issue, but I think it also has large national impacts because it's, I think, emblematic of the Trump administration's attempted trashing of public lands. But the question here is from Harley. What more can we do to prevent a proposed copper sulfide mine in northeast Minnesota? Some folks might have followed this. Proposed massive open pit mine on the edge of Boundary Waters wilderness area, which I believe is the most popular wilderness area in the U.S. And as some folks who followed Sierra Magazine's coverage of this know, the mine owner is Jared and Ivanka Trump's or Kushner's landlord in Washington, D.C. So, Melinda, has the Sierra Club been watchdogging this, and what can folks do, or what does that kind of attempted trashing of this iconic wilderness area mean?
Thanks, Jason. I'll be quick about the nexus here in Washington, D.C., but two ways in which the Sierra Club has been engaged are our local folks on the ground that have been fighting it, arming our people here, our lobbyists and other capacities in D.C. with the facts in order for us to be able to do advocacy on the Hill to push back on this bad idea. They want to move a freestanding bill to give away the land that would in fact threaten the boundary waters, but they're also looking to insert that provision into a funding bill as well. So we're fighting it here in DC, making sure that, again, you know, we use the Senate firewall to stop that from becoming law. And our folks on the ground are working very actively to draw attention to the great harm and the great giveaway to polluters that project would be. I don't know, Pat, if there's a legal angle here that you all have.
Yeah, there's been legal actions going on around this mine for years. I think it's probably a good example of how when you engage in the NEPA process and the commenting process, you can really slow things down. I think this mine would have been built already if it hadn't been for the engagement, early engagement. So there has been litigation. There will be litigation. Yeah, there's lots going on. And there's a good team. There's a very good team of people in place that are handling it.
Led by our North Star chapter, and folks there around the country, but especially in the Great Lakes region, should check in with the great work done by the Sierra Club's North Star chapter in Minnesota. A couple of questions here, and folks are going to be wrapping up in just about 5 minutes. So again, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I want to thank you for your really smart and thoughtful questions and comments. I think a couple of questions to round it out for Mike here, because they're big ones. One is, what is the Sierra Club doing to manage Trump fatigue, or I think in general kind of, you know, burnout from what seems like it can be a relentless torrent of bad news. And I think sort of on the flip side of that, another question here, what is the Sierra Club doing to also enlist, I guess, politically conservative environmentalists and to establish, you know, transpartisan or bipartisan connections through, you know, organizations like, say, the Climate Caucus?
Okay, well, thanks for the questions. First, on the Trump fatigue, I think that I'm not so sure that we feel it at the Sierra Club, to be honest with you. Our mission has never been more clear. Our purpose seems more urgent than it ever has been. Pat has no question about the need for he and his team. Melinda, I think, has never been more effective nor worked harder in her life. We have more than 700 staff, as I said earlier, tens of thousands of volunteers, and we know what our work is right now. I think the challenge for us is not to be defined by this administration and not have our organization's work simply be in resistance to what this administration is putting forward. President Trump won't be president forever. We will have environmental challenges well after his term of office has expired. So therefore, what we need to do is certainly we need to fight to uphold our air and water and land and wildlife and climate protections and the progress that we have made. But as we have said throughout this call, we are going to stay on the offense and to make sure that we actually make clear and tangible and measurable, profound progress everywhere else that we can, at the state level, at the local level, in the private sector, with anyone who wants to stand up and actually work with us to solve some of the problems that we have in this country. Which perhaps is a lead-in to the second question around building bridges across the aisle. We have to admit that right now in the Republican Party at the national level, there is an absence of leadership on climate change. We have seen in several cycles zero or next to zero candidates for federal office admit that climate change is real and actually advocate for solutions to climate change. But we know that there are millions of Republicans, conservatives, independents who care about the environment. They care about their parks. They care about wilderness areas. They love our national forests. They want to see clean energy take hold and continue to expand in this country. And so the way in which we do that is we find common value. We listen to folks regardless of their political persuasion. We don't hold back, and we're honest about an abdication of leadership or responsibility wherever we see it, in whatever party in which we see it. But we try to find ways in which people who care about the environment, who care about our democracy, find a home at the Sierra Club, regardless of their political affiliation.
And I think on that encouraging and optimistic note, we'll wrap it up for today. I really want to thank Michael. I want to thank Melinda and Pat for joining us. I especially want to thank all of you for tuning in. This is just going to be the first of many Sierra Forums we host this year. Again, giving you all, our members, supporters, and champions a chance to hear from leaders in the organization, a chance to hear from our allies and partners who are doing this work. So stay tuned, follow us. It sounds like you probably already are, but follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. Subscribe to our email list so you get action alerts about what's happening, and find out ways that you can continue to get engaged to defend our lands and waters and to promote these clean energy solutions. Anything else, Mike, you want to add as we wrap up?
No, just want to say quickly, thank you everybody for joining. And remember that if you care about our country and if you care about the environment, advocacy is not a spectator sport. We need you to continue to engage however you can. Thank you.
And that's it for today. Thanks, folks. Take care.